Now, there have been 3 police investigations, 11 inquests and several NHS special reports into the hundreds of deaths we now know about at the Gosport War Memorial Hospital in the 1990s. This week saw the publication of the latest report from the independent panel led by the former Bishop of Liverpool. It's taken 20 years, but on Wednesday the truth finally came out.
There was an institutionalised practice of the shortening of lives through prescribing and administering opioids without medical justification. Families will ask, how could this practice continue and not be stopped through the various police, regulatory and inquest processes? The panel's report shows how those processes of scrutiny unfolded and how the families were failed.
They arrived at the cathedral to hear that 456 people could have died this way, and possibly another 200 whose medical records are now missing.
Statement, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care.
It was a sombre health secretary who later spoke in the Commons.
Had the establishment listened when junior NHS staff spoke out? Had the establishment listened when ordinary families raised concerns instead of treating them as troublemakers? Many of those deaths would not have happened.
For the families, what now matters most is holding someone to account for the mistakes of the past. Joining me now from our Westminster studio is Bridget Reeves, whose grandmother Elsie Devine died in Gosport Hospital in 1999. Bridget, we've seen you speaking on the news on behalf of all the families. What's the mood about who should be held accountable? Because there were, Jane Barton's name comes up, but there must have been many other staff who knew what was happening, many people who turned a bit of a blind eye to what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to go back and realise that these nurses, when Jane Barton joined the hospital, in those days it was Redcliffe Annex, the nurses did raise the alarm almost immediately. And, from 1989, when the syringe drivers were introduced by Dr. Barton to start prescribing these very heavy opiates to patients, the nurses came forward and they went to the NMC and they went to the senior management staff at the hospital at the time, and they made their complaints, and those complaints were pushed aside. And they were made to feel like they were troublemakers. In fact, just talking about that fraction in the time frame, the daughter of Sylvia Giffen, who was one of those whistleblowers, has come forward since in the media and said that her mother, she's passed now, was bullied at the hospital, and she felt like she could no longer fight against what she believed was wrong.
How does it feel, having campaigned all this time, to hear these details from 20 years ago, but crucial bits of information, and the police saying, you've come forward, there is now documentation they've not seen before as a result of the inquiry?
The police came forward and said that they hadn't seen that documentation in the initial investigations. That documentation was available to them in what the panel called the third police investigation, and that was really instigated when Professor Richard Baker was commissioned to do his report after CHI had completed theirs, and that's when Sylvia Giffen came forward and said,
so
there are these documentations.
This was known to the police, in your opinion, anyway.
And well, it definitely was known by the time they did the third police investigation, because that's really what kicked it off.
There have been complaints about the way this was investigated by Hampshire Police. Are you hoping that there will be more than just another force taking this on, but looking into what went wrong with Hampshire Police? Well,
Hampshire Police have already said, that they're willing to stand back, and they made their apologies. I don't know if you've read the report yet. I mean, it's quite meaty, but even if you go to the forward that the Bishop has given, he categorically lists senior management, health organisations, the GMC, the NMC, the Hampshire Constabulary, local politicians, the coroners, the CPS. He lists them all as failing both patient and families.
Well, one thing they do say in the report, very conclusively, I think, that there was no collusion for a cover-up. What about Peter Viggers, who was the MP for Gosport? Do you include him in that? Because he resisted all along, quite strongly, the idea that there should be any investigation.
Well, it depends the way you look at it. I mean, yes, absolutely. He's got to stand up, and no one's heard from Peter Viggers since the report's been published, right? But it's one thing to stand against us having our justice and having the truth out there. It's another thing how many MPs actually stood there and let it go past. I mean, I've written to many MPs in my time. Yeah. Some of them who were actually from a medical background, who still didn't go any further. I mean, the only MP, and through Gillian Mackenzie's persistence, that did anything about this was Stephen Lloyd.
And then Norman Lamb as well. Interesting,
and
Liberal
then,
Democrats.
Exactly. Yeah. So without Norman, we wouldn't have got anywhere, and his hands were tied. Yeah. If we had had the public inquiry which we wanted, which the government said we can't have because this isn't of national interest. Yeah. I mean, you can clearly see now it is of national interest. I mean, this is a massive catastrophe for both the NHS and the police and government as a whole. And that's why we need to act on it quickly. We need this resolved.
Right. Robert Courts, doesn't reflect well on politicians. I know those relatives wrote letter after letter to all sorts of MPs, Secretaries of State, going back, over Labour, Conservative. It doesn't reflect well on the whole system.
Well, I mean, firstly, can I just express my absolute horror at what we've learned over the course of the last week, and pay tribute to Bridget and everyone else who's worked so hard to bring this case to light, and they deserve that recognition. We absolutely have a duty as politicians to look at what has happened, who was responsible, and to do absolutely everything in our power to make sure this can't happen again. I don't think there's a party political point here. I pay tribute to all MPs of any party and any colour, and Jeremy Hunt was, I think, very measured and very good tone, and he was thanked by Norman Lamb.
And he apologised
but he was thanked by Norman Lamb for the support he'd given him.
Is this a turning point for the NHS?
Well, I think it's important. It's difficult to say at this stage. I mean, one of the points that I was keen to raise this week is that we have to look at absolutely everything. We have to look at the culture, look at everything that affects patient safety across the whole spectrum, whatever it may be. It may mean that leads to some NHS changes. It's difficult for me as a politician to say that. What it is for us to do is to look at what's happened and then to apply pressure and make sure it can never happen again.
Okay. It is shocking, isn't it?
It's absolutely shocking. I mean, to think that so many people knew about this, the families were campaigning for so long. There's 3 police inquiries, and it took all of that before the facts came out. But I think what I would say is that, if you have a sort of, a culture of litigation, a culture of blame, then sometimes people do have a tendency to cover things up. And I know, for example, in the aviation industry, if you have an accident, then there's immediately a sort of no-blame culture. Let's just sort out, let's see what's going on. And I think that will be a more healthy culture in our health service than the sort of American
Jeremy Hunt's introduced
style.
these whistleblower champions in hospitals.
Yeah, well, this is something else I've worked on in the European context, much better protection for whistleblowers, because if you're working in an organisation and you see something wrong, you're worried about your job, you're worried about what might happen with your boss and so on. So you need to have that protection if you have information in the public interest.
OK. Those all sound like good things, Bridget. Enough, or are you going to have to keep pushing?
Well, I've said it before, but these... we as the families have had to push all the way here. We've had no support, we've had no legal representation, and we've certainly had no support from any of these bodies that I've mentioned, including the government. And it has taken over 20 years of my mother's life and other families that have been at the forefront of getting justice for their loved ones. So it's really, for me, about time that the government stood up and said, right, we're going to carry you to the next stage, and in our mind that's criminal prosecution. So get us there, don't make us wait, don't put us on the back pile, which is what always seems to be happening when we have these independent inquiries.
OK, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.